In this video, we'll explain some of the concepts behind virtual networking and how our virtual machines can connect to other resources, either within the same ESXi host or possibly even resources connected to our physical network. So, how do virtual machines actually handle transmitting and receiving network traffic? Well, in many ways, they work exactly the same way that a physical machine does. So here we see a virtual machine and it has a network interface card just like any other network connected machine. But in this case, we're dealing with a virtual NIC. Now our guest operating system, in this case Windows, has no idea that the virtual NIC is not an actual hardware device. Right? Windows just sees a network interface card. And from the perspective of the guest operating system, that's really the end of the story. So Windows sends some packet to the virtual NIC, and my virtual NIC, just like a physical NIC would, my virtual NIC needs to connect to a switch. Right? So our virtual machines will connect to a virtual machine port group on a virtual switch. And the port group is used to define settings like VLAN membership and security policies and stuff like that. And my ESXi host also has physical interfaces, but my traffic doesn't necessarily need to flow over a physical interface. If I've got multiple virtual machines connected to the same port group, they can communicate without their traffic ever flowing over a physical network. And then, of course, my ESXi host itself has some physical network interfaces that connect to a physical switch. These are called VMNICs. And if my traffic needs to flow to the internet or to some physical server, it'll do so using these VMNICs or physical adapters. So a VMNIC is basically an uplink for a virtual switch that gives it connectivity to the actual physical network. But our virtual machine port groups are really only half the story. Right? My VM port groups are for all of my virtual machine traffic. Everything else is going to be handled by a VM kernel port. Right? So the virtual machine port groups are kind of like ports on a physical switch that a PC would connect to or a server would connect to. Whereas VM kernel ports are special types of ports on a virtual switch that are used for traffic like vMotion or IP storage or management. These are ports that the hosts and vCenter use to talk amongst themselves for purposes other than virtual machine traffic. And then our hosts and our virtual switches also support VLANs and they support trunk ports as well, right? So for example, let's say I've got two virtual machines here. The virtual machine on top is connected to a port group with VLAN 10 assigned to it. Okay, so my VM on the top of my diagram here is connected to a port group that has VLAN 10 assigned, and my VM on the bottom is connected to a different port group with a different VLAN assigned. So as traffic flows into the virtual switch from my VM on the top of the screen, it's going to hit a port group that's tagged with VLAN 10. And if that VM is trying to communicate with the other VM, that traffic is actually going to have to flow out the physical network to a switch, hit a router that can route between VLANs, and eventually that traffic will flow back in. Right? And that's kind of how our VLAN segmentation works with a virtual switch, is each VM will connect to a port group. Those port groups will have VLANs defined, and we will have a trunk port to a physical switch that is able to handle traffic across multiple VLANs on a single physical connection. That way the physical switch can actually see a consistent set of VLANs and can see which virtual machine traffic belongs on which VLAN as that traffic arrives. So for the purposes of the VMware Certified Associate exam, you really want to understand that there are these things called virtual switches that exist within the ESXi host. And on them, we've got virtual machine port groups. And each virtual machine is going to be equipped with a virtual NIC. Right? You may have heard some of the options there, like a VMXNet 3 virtual network interface card. Those are going to provide connectivity to the virtual machine port groups on the virtual switches. It's basically like having a fake switch running inside of your ESXi host that interconnects all of those VMs on that host and also applies VLAN tagging and security policies, right, based on those port group memberships.